The Palantíri. The Palantíri were no doubt never matters of common use or common knowledge, even in Númenor. In Middle-earth they were kept in guarded rooms, high in strong towers. Only kings and rulers and their appointed wardens had access to them, and they were never consulted nor exhibited publicly. But until the passing of the kings they were not sinister secrets. Their use involved no peril, and no king or other person authorized to survey them would have hesitated to reveal the source of his knowledge of the deeds or opinions of distant rulers, if obtained through the stones. Doubtless they were used in the consultations between Arnor and Gondor in the year 1944, concerning the succession to the crown. The messages received in Gondor in 1973, telling of the dire straits of the northern kingdom, was possibly their last use until the approach of the War of the Ring. After the days of the kings and the loss of Minas Ithil, there is no further mention of their open and official use. There was no answering stone left in the north after the shipwreck of Arvedui last king in the year 1975.
With Arvedui were lost the stones of Annúminas and Amon Sûl, Weathertop. The third Palantir of the north was that in the tower Elostirion in Emin Beraid.
In 2002, the Ithil stone was lost. There then remained only the Anor stone in Minas Ithil and the Orthanc stone.
The stone of Osgiliath had been lost in the waters of Anduin in 1437, during the civil war of the kin strife.
Two things contributed then to the neglect of the stones and their passing out of the general memory of the people. The first was ignorance of what had happened to the Ithil stone. It was reasonably assumed that it was destroyed by the defenders before Minas Ithil was captured and sacked. But it was clearly possible that it had been seized and had come into the possession of Sauron, and some of the wiser and more far-seeing may have considered this. It would appear that they did so, and realized that the stone would be of little use to him for the damage of Gondor, unless it made contact with another stone that was in accord with it. By themselves, the stones could only see scenes or figures in distant places or in the past. These were without explanation, and, at any rate for men of later days, it was difficult to direct what visions should be revealed by the will or desire of a surveyor. But when another mind occupied a stone in accord, thought could be transferred, received as speech, and visions of the things in the mind of the surveyor of one stone could be seen by the other surveyor. These powers were originally used mainly in consultation, for the purpose of exchanging news necessary to government, or advice and opinions, less often in simple friendship and pleasure, or in greetings and condolence. It was only Sauron who used a stone for the transference of his superior will, dominating the weaker surveyor and forcing him to reveal hidden thought and to submit to commands. It was for this reason, it may be supposed, that the Anor stone, about which all the records of the stewards are silent until the War of the Ring, was kept as a closely guarded secret, accessible only to the ruling stewards and never by them used, it seems, until Denethor II. The second reason was the decay of Gondor, and the waning of interest in or knowledge of ancient history among all but a few even of the high men of the realm, except insofar as it concerned their genealogies, their descent and kinship. Gondor, after the kings, declined into a middle age of fading knowledge and simpler skills. Communications depended on messengers and errand riders, or in times of urgency upon beacons, and if the stones of Anor and Orthanc were still guarded as treasures out of the past, known to exist only by a few, the 7 stones of old were by the people generally forgotten, and the rhymes of lore that spoke of them were, if remembered, no longer understood. Their operations were transformed in legend into the elvish powers of the ancient kings with their piercing eyes, and the swift, bird-like spirits that attended on them, bringing them news or bearing their messages. The Orthanc stone appears to have been at this time long disregarded by the stewards. It was no longer of any use to them, and was secure in its impregnable tower. Even if it too had not been overshadowed by the doubt concerning the Ithil stone, it stood in a region with which Gondor became less and less directly concerned. Calenarthon, never densely populated, had been devastated by the Dark Plague of 1636, and thereafter steadily denuded of inhabitants of Númenórean descent by migration to Ithilien and lands nearer Anduin. Isengard remained a personal possession of the stewards, but Orthanc itself became deserted, and eventually it was closed and its keys removed to Minas Ithil. If Beren the steward considered the stone at all when he gave these to Saruman, he probably thought that it could be in no safer hands than those of the head of the council opposed to Sauron. Saruman had no doubt from his investigations gained a special knowledge of the stones, things that would attract his attention, and had become convinced that the Orthanc stone was still intact in its tower. He acquired the keys of Orthanc in 2759, nominally as Warden of the Tower and Lieutenant of the Steward of Gondor. At that time the matter of the Orthanc stone would hardly concern the White Council. Only Saruman, having gained the favour of the stewards, had yet made sufficient study of the records of Gondor to perceive the interest of the Palantíri and the possible uses of those that survived. But of this he said nothing to his colleagues. Owing to Saruman's jealousy and hatred of Gandalf, he ceased to cooperate with the council, which last met in 2953. Without any formal declaration, Saruman then seized Isengard as his own domain, and paid no further attention to Gondor. The council no doubt disapproved of this, but Saruman was a free agent, and had the right, if he wished, to act independently according to his own policy in the resistance to Sauron. For any more worldly policy of power and warlike strength, Isengard was well placed, being the key to the Gap of Rohan. This was a weak point in the defences of the West, especially since the decay of Gondor. Through it, hostile spies and emissaries could pass in secret, or eventually, as in the former age, forces of war. The council seems to have been unaware, since for many years Isengard had been closely guarded, of what went on within its ring. The use and possibly special breeding of orcs was kept secret, and cannot have begun much before 2990 at earliest. The orc troops seem never to have been used beyond the territory of Isengard before the attack on Rohan. Had the council known of this, they would, of course, at once have realized that Saruman had become evil. The council in general must independently have known of the stones and their ancient dispositions, but they did not regard them as of much present importance. They were things that belonged to the history of the kingdoms of the Dúnedain, marvellous and admirable, but mostly now lost or rendered of little use. It must be remembered that the stones were originally innocent, serving no evil purpose. It was Sauron who made them sinister, and instruments of domination and deceit. Though warned by Gandalf, the council may have begun to doubt Saruman's designs as regarded the rings. Not even Gandalf knew that he had become an ally or servant of Sauron. This Gandalf only discovered in July 3018. But although Gandalf had in latter years enlarged his own and the council's knowledge of Gondor's history by study of its documents, his and their chief concern was still with the ring. The possibilities latent in the stones were not realized. It is evident that at the time of the War of the Ring, the council had not long become aware of the doubt concerning the fate of the Ithil stone, and failed, understandably, even in such persons as Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf, under the weight of their cares, to appreciate its significance, to consider what might be the result if Sauron became possessed of one of the stones, and anyone else should then make use of another. It needed the demonstration on Dol Baran of the effects of the Orthanc stone on Peregrine to reveal suddenly that the link between Isengard and Barad-dûr, seen to exist after it was discovered that forces of Isengard had been joined with others directed by Sauron in the attack on the Fellowship at Parth Galen, was in fact the Orthanc stone and one other Palantír. In his talk to Peregrine as they rode on Shadowfax from Dol Baran, Gandalf's immediate object was to give the hobbit some idea of the history of the Palantíri, so that he might begin to realize the ancientry, dignity, and power of things that he had presumed to meddle with. He was not concerned to exhibit his own processes of discovery and deduction, except in its last point, to explain how Sauron came to have control of them, so that they were perilous for anyone, however exalted, to use. But Gandalf's mind was at the same time earnestly busy with the stones, considering the bearings of the revelation at Dol Baran upon many things that he had observed and pondered, such as the wide knowledge of events far away possessed by Denethor, and his appearance of premature old age, first observable when he was not much above 60 years old, although he belonged to a race and family that still normally had longer lives than other men. Undoubtedly Gandalf's haste to reach Minas Tirith, in addition to the urgency of the time and the imminence of war, was quickened by his sudden fear that Denethor also had made use of a Palantír, the Anor stone, and his desire to judge what effect this had had on him, whether in the crucial test of desperate war it would not prove that he, like Saruman, was no longer to be trusted and might surrender to Mordor. Gandalf's dealings with Denethor on arrival in Minas Tirith, and in the following days, and all things that they are reported to have said to one another, must be viewed in the light of this doubt in Gandalf's mind. Denethor was evidently aware of Gandalf's guesses and suspicions, and at once both angered and sardonically amused by them. Note his words to Gandalf at their meeting in Minas Tirith. "I know already sufficient of these deeds for my own counsel against the menace of the East," and especially his mocking words that followed. "Yea, for though the stones be lost, they say, still the lords of Gondor have keener sight than lesser men, and many messages come to them." Quite apart from the Palantíri, Denethor was a man of great mental powers and a quick reader of thoughts behind faces and words, but he may well also have actually seen in the Anor stone visions of events in Rohan and Isengard. The importance of the Palantír of Minas Tirith in his thoughts thus dated only from Peregrine's experience on Dol Baran, but his knowledge or guesses concerning its existence were, of course, much earlier. Little is known of Gandalf's history until the end of the Watchful Peace, 2460, and the formation of the White Council, 2463. And his special interest in Gondor seems only to have been shown after Bilbo's finding of the ring, 2941, and Sauron's open return to Mordor, 2951. His attention was then, as was Saruman's, concentrated on the Ring of Isildur, but in his reading in the archives of Minas Tirith, he may be assumed to have learned much about the Palantíri of Gondor, though with less immediate appreciation of their possible significance than that shown by Saruman, whose mind was, in contrast to Gandalf's, always more attracted by artifacts and instruments of power than by persons. Gandalf, all the same, probably at that time already knew more than did Saruman about the nature and ultimate origin of the Palantíri, since all that concerned the ancient realm of Arnor and the later history of those regions was his special province, and he was in close alliance with Elrond. But the Anor stone had become a secret. No mention of its fate after the fall of Minas Ithil appeared in any of the annals or records of the stewards. History would indeed make it clear that neither Orthanc nor the White Tower in Minas Ithil had ever been captured or sacked by enemies, and it might therefore be supposed that the stones were most probably intact and remained in their ancient sites. But it could not be certain that they had not been removed by the stewards, and perhaps buried deep in some secret treasure chamber, even one in some last hidden refuge in the mountains, comparable to Dunharrow. Gandalf should have been reported as saying that he did not think that Denethor had presumed to use it, until his wisdom failed. He could not state it as a known fact, for when and why Denethor had dared to use the stone was and remains a matter of conjecture. Gandalf might well think as he did on the matter, but it is probable, considering Denethor and what is said about him, that he began to use the Anor stone many years before 1319, and earlier than Saruman ventured or thought it useful to use the stone of Orthanc. Denethor succeeded to the stewardship in 2984, being then 54 years old, a masterful man, both wise and learned beyond the measure of those days, and strong-willed, confident in his own powers, and dauntless. His grimness was first observable to others after his wife Finduilas died in 2988, but it seems fairly plain that he had at once turned to the stone as soon as he came to power, having long studied the matter of the Palantíri and the traditions regarding them and their use, preserved in the special archives of the stewards, available beside the ruling steward only to his heir. During the end of the rule of his father, Ecthelion II, he must have greatly desired to consult the stone as anxiety in Gondor increased, while his own position was weakened by the fame of Thorongil and the favour shown to him by his father. At least one of his motives must have been jealousy of Thorongil, and hostility to Gandalf, to whom, during the ascendancy of Thorongil, his father paid much attention. Denethor desired to suppress these usurpers in knowledge and information, and also, if possible, to keep an eye on them when they were elsewhere. The breaking strain of Denethor's confrontation of Sauron must be distinguished from the general strain of using the stone. The latter Denethor thought that he could endure, and not without reason. Confrontation with Sauron almost certainly did not occur for many years, and was probably never originally contemplated by Denethor. Denethor could, after he had acquired the skill, learn much of distant events by the use of the Anor stone alone, and even after Sauron became aware of his operations he could still do so, as long as he retained the strength to control his stone to his own purposes, in spite of Sauron's attempt to wrench the Anor stone always towards himself. It must also be considered that the stones were only a small item in Sauron's vast designs and operations, a means of dominating and deluding two of his opponents, but he would not and could not have the Ithil stone under perpetual observation. It was not his way to commit such instruments to the use of subordinates, nor had he any servant whose mental powers were superior to Saruman's, or even Denethor's. In the case of Denethor, the steward was strengthened even against Sauron himself by the fact that the stones were far more amenable to legitimate users, most of all to true heirs of Elendil, as Aragorn, but also to one with inherited authority, as Denethor, as compared to Saruman or Sauron. It may be noted that the effects were different. Saruman fell under the domination of Sauron and desired his victory, or no longer opposed it. Denethor remained steadfast in his rejection of Sauron, but was made to believe that his victory was inevitable, and so fell into despair. The reasons for this difference were no doubt that in the first place Denethor was a man of great strength of will, and maintained the integrity of his personality until the final blow of the apparently mortal wound of his only surviving son. He was proud, but this was by no means merely personal. He loved Gondor and its people, and deemed himself appointed by destiny to lead them in this desperate time. and in the second place the Anor stone was his by right, and nothing but expediency was against his use of it in his grave anxieties. He must have guessed that the Ithil stone was in evil hands, and risked contact with it, trusting his strength. His trust was not entirely unjustified. Sauron failed to dominate him, and could only influence him by deceits. Probably he did not at first look towards Mordor, but was content with such far views as the stone would afford, hence his surprising knowledge of events far off. Whether he ever thus made contact with the Orthanc stone and Saruman is not told. Probably he did, and did so with profit to himself. Sauron could not break in on these conferences. Only the surveyor using the Master Stone of Osgiliath could eavesdrop. While 2 of the other stones were in response, the third would find them both blank. There must have been a considerable lore concerning the Palantíri preserved in Gondor by the kings and stewards, and handed down even after use was no longer made of them. These stones were an inalienable gift to Elendil and his heirs, to whom alone they belonged by right. But this does not mean that they could only be used rightfully by one of these heirs. They could be used lawfully by anyone authorized by either the heir of Anarion or the heir of Isildur, that is, a lawful king of Gondor or Arnor. Actually, they must normally have been used by such deputies. Each stone had its own warden, one of whose duties was to survey the stone at regular intervals, or when commanded, or in times of need. Other persons also were appointed to visit the stones, and ministers of the crown concerned with intelligence made regular and special inspections of them, reporting the information so gained to the king and council, or to the king privately as the matter demanded. In Gondor, latterly, as the office of steward rose in importance and became hereditary, providing, as it were, a permanent understudy to the king and an immediate viceroy at need, the command and use of the stones seems mainly to have been in the hands of the stewards, and the traditions concerning their nature and use to have been guarded and transmitted in their house. Since the stewardship had become hereditary from 1998 onwards, so the authority to use or again to depute the use of the stones was lawfully transmitted in their line, and belonged therefore fully to Denethor. The case was different in Arnor. Lawful possession of the stones belonged to the king, who normally used the stone of Annúminas, but the kingdom became divided, and the high kingship was in dispute. The kings of Arthedain, who were plainly those with the just claim, maintained a special warden at Amon Sûl, whose stone was held to be the chief of the northern Palantíri, being the largest and most powerful, and the one through which communication with Gondor was mainly conducted. After the destruction of Amon Sûl by Angmar in 1409, both stones were placed at Fornost, where the king of Arthedain dwelt. These were lost in the shipwreck of Arvedui, and no deputy was left with any authority, direct or inherited, to use the stones. Only one remained in the north, the Elendil stone on Emin Beraid, but this was one of special properties, and not employable in communications. Hereditary right to use it would no doubt still reside in the heir of Isildur, the recognized chieftain of the Dúnedain and descendant of Arvedui, but it is not known whether any of them, including Aragorn, ever looked into it, desiring to gaze into the lost west. This stone and its tower were maintained and guarded by Círdan and the Elves of Lindon. The lore of the stones is now forgotten, and can only be partly recovered by conjecture and from things recorded about them. They were perfect spheres, appearing when at rest to be made of solid glass or crystal, deep black in hue. At smallest they were about a foot in diameter, but some, certainly the stones of Osgiliath and Amon Sûl, were much larger and could not be lifted by one man. Originally they were placed in sites suitable to their sizes and intended uses, standing on low round tables of black marble in a central cup or depression, in which they could at need be revolved by hand. They were very heavy, but perfectly smooth, and would suffer no damage if by accident or malice they were unseated and rolled off their tables. They were indeed unbreakable by any violence then controlled by men, though some believed that great heat such as that of Orodruin might shatter them, and surmised that this had been the fate of the Ithil stone in the Fall of Barad-dûr. Though without any external markings of any kind, they had permanent poles, and were originally so placed in their sites that they stood upright. Their diameters from pole to pole pointed to the earth's centre, but the permanent nether pole must then be at the bottom. The faces along the circumference in this position were the viewing faces, receiving the visions from the outside, but transmitting them to the eye of a surveyor upon the far side. A surveyor, therefore, who wished to look west, would place himself on the east side of the stone, and if he wished to shift his vision northward, must move to his left, southward. But the minor stones, those of Orthanc, Ithil, and Arnor, and probably Annúminas, had also fixed orientation in their original situation, so that, for example, their west face would only look west, and turned in other directions was blank. If a stone became unseated or disturbed, it could be reset by observation, and it was then useful to revolve it. But when removed and cast down, as was the Orthanc stone, it was not so easy to set right. So it was by chance, as men call it, as Gandalf would have said, that Peregrine, fumbling with the stone, must have set it on the ground more or less upright, and sitting westward of it have had the fixed eastward-looking face in the proper position. The major stones were not so fixed. Their circumference could be revolved, and they could still see in any direction. Alone, the Palantíri could only see, they did not transmit sound. Ungoverned by a directing mind, they were wayward, and their visions were, apparently at least, haphazard. From a high place, their westward face, for instance, would look to vast distance, its vision blurred and distorted to either side and above and below, and its foreground obscured by things behind, receding in ever-diminishing clarity. Also, what they saw was directed or hindered by chance, by darkness, or by shrouding. The vision of the Palantíri was not blinded or occluded by physical obstacles, but only by darkness, so they could look through a mountain, as they could look through a patch of dark or shadow, but see nothing within that did not receive some light. They could see through walls, but see nothing within rooms, caves, or vaults unless some light fell on it, and they could not themselves provide or project light. It was possible to guard against their sight by the process called shrouding, by which certain things or areas would be seen in a stone only as a shadow or a deep mist. How this was done, by those aware of the stones and the possibility of being watched by them, is one of the lost mysteries of the Palantíri.